It's just after I see a movie, I like to go get a piece of pie and talk about it. It's sort of a little tradition I have. Do you like to get pie after you see a good movie?
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Queer Film Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Rowe, and this week I'm with Matthew. Hey Matthew,
Hey, Brian.
how are you doing? Happy Halloween.
Yeah, happy almost Halloween. And we've got a suitably Halloweeny pairing for today. I was really interested when Brian pitched this pairing because it's one of those things that didn't make intuitive sense immediately, but then Brian explained his rationale for choosing it. And I was like, oh yeah, that's totally true. So do you want to throw out your explanation behind this choice, Brian?
Yeah, definitely. We've talked about this before on the podcast, and everybody knows, I feel like it's a plot point in the Scream series that sex is bad in horror films, in the horror genre. If you have sex, you're going to die. You're going to be punished for it, whether it's in Scream or the Halloween movies, or pick a horror movie. And so It Follows and X take that and really run it to the extreme, where they're literally being punished for having sex by the monsters in the movie, not just by the genre itself. And so that gives it a broader significance to the sex is bad in horror films. And I just wanted to use that as a way in to discuss, a couple horror films for October, and that tropiest of tropes is that sex is bad and we're going to punish you for having sex. Go ahead.
It's especially interesting in the case of X too, because X kind of presents itself, at least up front, as a sex positive rewriting of that sort of moralism of the slasher, right? But it ends up, as I'm excited to discuss, it ends up kind of aestheticizing sex in the same horrific way that, all of these slashers do. The pairing with It Follows, as Brian was saying, these are both movies that not only carry the tropes of sort of puritanical or moralistic views of sex that are imbued in all horror movies, really, since forever, especially since the 80s.
Since Psycho, I would say.
Yeah, that's true. But not only do these movies sort of carry the tropes as passive remnants of their genre, but they thematize them in an interesting way. They incorporate sex and the ideas of punitive sex, or not punitive sex, but punishments for sex into a very narrative and thematically heavy package for both of these movies. Right, with It Follows, you have a chain, a haunting that is passed on by having sex, and in X, you have this kind of gosh, I don't know, where would we even start for X and its whole sexual politics? It's a 70s pastiche that has to do with porno and people who don't like porno and people who are jealous of porno and people who, oh gosh, there's so much going into X, and maybe we'll finally figure it out on this podcast.
Oh, definitely. We will get to X, but first let's talk about It Follows, the 2014 film, directed by David Robert Mitchell, who hasn't done anything else that I'm really aware of. The whole premise is that the beginning of the movie opens with Micah Monroe, Jay. The movie opens. We'll skip all that. The gist of the movie is that she hooks up with this guy, and then he tells her to be careful. Now that I fucked you, you're going to be followed by this creepy entity. So go have sex with somebody else, and then it'll go to them. If it kills you, it comes to me. So now we're both cursed. And he runs away. Which is a really just a fucked up premise on which to base a movie. It feels like a literal walking metaphor for AIDS.
Yeah,
but they're also these two straight people. One of the notes that I had, so apparently it's passed on during sex. One of the notes I wrote: this would never work in the gay community. Just go to a bathhouse and this thing will get lost.
It would be a total corn maze. Yeah.
Yeah. He's like, I don't know. I don't even know anymore. I don't know what's happening. I lost track. I give up.
And it's funny too, because I know a lot of people have sort of jokingly tried to figure out ways to thwart this monster. I mean, the one that comes to mind first and foremost is Adam from YMS, Your Movie Sucks, went on this whole thing about, well, does it count if it's a hand job? What if What if there's a man train is the quote that I remember most most vividly from him. So there's all of this kind of like mechanical questioning, but it's essentially a daisy chain of playing, tag you're it with this virus. It's got sort of the communicability aspect of what makes viruses terrifying, but it also has this kind of selfish and sadistic aspect of if you pass it on to somebody else, you are in the clear. It is inflicting it on somebody else to save your own hide.
Yeah, and it's like most basic level. It's like a metaphor for STIs and AIDS.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. How were you first introduced to this movie, Brian? Because I remember when this came out in 2014, and there was so much buzz around it. Everything that I kept hearing about it is it's a horror movie about STIs, right? With the about doing a lot of work there, right? But,
right.
How did you hear about this movie? How did you what biases or what assumptions did you have going into it?
I saw it when it was fairly new. I don't remember. I'll be honest, I don't remember specifically. It wasn't a movie that I heard about and then waited a long time to go see or anything. I feel like I heard about it or I saw the trailer or something. Probably I watched it on YouTube or something. And then I went to go see it because I don't really remember there being a lot of, that sort of talk around it until I started to meet and know other people who saw it as well. And then we would be talking about it and we would all kind of come to those conclusions ourselves and like joke about it. But I think I came to it as like a horror film. My memory of it is that I feel like I said, I don't remember super well, but I think the reason for that is probably because I heard about it and it was out or it was coming out very shortly. And I just went to see it. And I ended up really, really liking it. But again, I don't think there was a lot of build up before I went to go see it.
Yeah, part of the reason why I'm curious about that specifically, what expectations you had going into this movie and what image it formed in your mind at the time of seeing it is because I really think this is like a nexus point for the sort of loose subgenre of horror or subclassification of horror that we have now of elevated horror, right? Quote unquote, elevated horror, allegorical horror, prestige horror, whatever you want to call it, the thing that A24 has made their bread and butter out of, right? And I feel like It Follows and The Babadook were at the center of this. They both came out in 2014. I have sort of a mixed memory of both of them in that I think I saw both of them like back to back because I ordered both of them from Netflix on their DVD service because I had been reading about them on like the R Movies subreddit or something, both as these kind of like underground cult hits that will redefine the way you think about horror, specifically always with the caveat of it's like, oh, it's horror, but it's like really smart, which has been kind of a discursive thread that has really tainted the conversation around horror, I think, in the past couple of years. But It Follows as this sort of central piece of elevated or allegorical horror is something that I'm wondering now. I can't even remember really what the discussion around it was at the time, or if it felt singular at the time. It sounds like, Brian, you had kind of that cult experience of it where you saw it was really good and nobody else was talking about it. Did you have the same thing with The Babadook by any chance? Was that what was the Babadook?
I remember going to see with people. By the time I went to see it, it had earned a bit of a reputation as this like horror movie that was like doing well in specialty theaters, and I'm a fan of horror, and I was working with people who were fans of horror, and we went to go see it.
Yeah, so I mean that's part of the continuity that I think is also interesting in connecting It Follows with X, which we'll get to later, is that X coming out under A24 and very kind of like conspicuously branded as an A24 movie, not just in terms of production and distribution, but as a kind of genre qualifier. People have started to read A24, those, that letter and two numbers, as a sort of descriptor of style, as a descriptor of aesthetic texture. And I think X is probably one of the better examples of that sort of reaching its mainstream point. I mean, it has been for a while, but X is so solidly an A24 slasher movie to me. And I'm curious if if that's legible to anybody else or if that even means anything significant, but we'll get to that later. One of the things that I think is interesting, just as we sort of like circle the drain on It Follows in the plot description, is how much this question of metaphor comes up in just talking about the movie and talking about the plot. One of my big bugbears with a lot of horror is that when it goes straight to the realm of pure allegory, where you don't have any layer of the real or of diegetic consequences for anything that's happening on the screen, because you're told that this is all sort of a smokescreen for a larger topic. It's the perpetual, oh, it's really about this. I don't think It Follows comes off that way. It's not really a movie that exists solely in metaphor, but it has a lot of it has a lot of legibility in terms of, like you said, Brian. It sort of references the fear of catching something that was particularly potent with the AIDS crisis. If you were to, do you feel like you can read this movie as any one metaphor?
No. And I think that's what I like about it. And I think that's why it's successful, because I think if it was specifically one metaphor, then it becomes very much about that. And they're hitting you over the head with it. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. The fact that there's a few and then it's sort of ephemeral and you could find 5 or 6 or 7 different things that it might be about is what good horror is and does. I think good horror is always about something. Yeah. Halloween is about something, more than just, Michael Myers represents something in the culture.
It's kind of up to anybody at this point what he represents now after the freaking
right. But like after all of this time, yeah, but now he's a brand and now he represents dollar signs. But in that original movie, and in those movies of the 70s, which both of these films, and that's another reason I think to pair these films, is because they are very sort of stylistically similar. X, like if you could put, I feel like the first 20 minutes I was watching it and I was like, are they just doing Chainsaw? Is this just Texas Chainsaw? Like almost verbatim. I mean, obviously it was like hornier. All it needed was a guy in a wheelchair and a hitchhiker. But that's also what I liked about it, because my favorite kind of horror isn't like a jump scare. It's something where you're watching the movie and you're like, I don't know what the fuck is going on. And I don't know what the fuck is going to happen next. And that's the scary part. And I think that's, for example, like the original Halloween, I think really works because it's just this fucking guy. And what's this mask that he's wearing? And in this, and that's the other thing about this. And this is another great thing. And I think you can tie this into the sort of the STI metaphor, is that the monster, the entity they call it, I think in the credits, could literally be anyone. And like the opening scene, like the movie got me in the opening scene the first time I saw it, because he's looking around, he's like, we got to go. Because he's asking about, like, don't you see that woman in the dress? And she doesn't. She's like, what are you talking about? And then from that moment, you're like, what the fuck? Like, it's so mysterious and weird. And the movie does a really good job, and the director does a really good job of maintaining that sense of what the fuckness. And I think that's why it works.
Yeah, it's got a great sense of training you to watch the background. Any extra could be the monster, realistically. And you mentioned, you are not watching horror movies for the jump scares specifically, but this movie's got some pretty damn good jump scares. The one that always sort of sticks in my mind as like a traumatized little button on my brain is when they're holed up in the bedroom. They know that
I know exactly what you're saying.
The entity, yes, is in the house, and there's the knocking on the door. They open the door and it's their friend, and you're like, oh, okay, false flag. And then this enormous, impossibly tall, lanky thing just looms out of the darkness behind him. It's just the perfect setup, false payoff, and then the real payoff. And there are several scenes like that in this movie that feature the entity being not quite even a jump scare, but something that's there in the frame waiting to be activated. The other great one is when they flee to the beach and they're sitting around on the beach, and you get sort of the shot counter shot of two characters talking. And when the shot is on Jay, you see, I think it's her friend like walking up behind her, but you can't tell if the other girl sees it because you are currently in the POV of the other girl. And it's not until you cut back and you see her, you see her POV fresh and the girl's not there anymore, that you realize, oh shit, that's that's it. That's, the thing. That's the it that follows. Yeah, well, and also, I mean, the other thing I think you alluded to in talking about sort of the setting of this movie and what makes it similar to X. It Follows is sort of set in this really indeterminate time period. I read some stuff where the director says that it was kind of very consciously obfuscated when this takes place. A lot of fans' favorite little artifacts from this movie is the best friends. She's got like this little like e-reader that she is reading a book on while Jay is in the hospital. And it's like this clamshell phone flip up thing that is literally in the shape of a shell. It's very cool. It's very analog, but it's also, you look at it and it's got the bars for reception. So you're like, oh, this is a cell phone, I guess. It's not just an it's very confusing as a little, piece of prop work in the movie. And I think I read that the director included that and had it custom made for the movie just to further, muddy the waters in terms of when the hell is this taking place. You kind of get vibes that it's the 80s, maybe the 90s. It also could very well be present day. What did you think, Brian? When the hell is this movie set?
No, I'm glad you brought that up because I love that little seashell thing. And I think that it plays into what you were talking about earlier about how the entire mise en scène of the movie is anything could happen, anything could jump out, and you're looking for clues, and you kind of you're scanning the movie for like some sense of like comfort, but you see this seashell thing that doesn't make any sense, and you see like a 1980s car next to a 1990s car, and you're like, this still doesn't make sense. And so your brain internally is like searching for that stuff. And that's what makes this. And I think at the end of the day, with both of these movies, another good reason to pair them is that I think they're both such good horror films. And they're two of probably my favorites of the last several years.
Well, and I think another sort of operative force that is shared in both of these movies is nostalgia. It's very, very clear cut in X. X is like so obviously, like you said before, it's like, is this Texas Chainsaw? It's very, very obviously doing like this whole 70s slasher pastiche thing, and then, adding its own commentary to that. So at least with X, it's pretty clear cut. Like this is nostalgia baiting for sure. With It Follows, I think it's a lot more difficult to place exactly where that nostalgic feeling lies. But I seem to recall when the movie came out, a lot of people, again, I'm going back to the subreddit, but a lot of people on Reddit that I was, hearing talk about this movie and gush about it, a part of what they really loved about it was this sense of retroness, this sense of a certain kind of environmental nostalgia that just sort of sits in the movie. And I'm trying to figure out what exactly makes this movie feel that way. And I think a lot of it has to do, like you said, Brian, with the general mise en scène of the movie and the sets and the locations. There's the public school, there's the neighborhood cul-de-sac, there's the high school swimming pool, or like the YMCA swimming pool where the whole denouement takes place. There's the beach. Everything sort of seems like it fits into this landscape of childhood memories in a weird way. There's that scene that we talked about with the guy looming in the doorway. It's taking place in somebody's house at night after dark in like a teenager's bedroom. Like there's something very like retrograde nostalgia. Something about this movie really feels like it is designed to tickle that sort of backward thinking part of your brain.
I think it's this sort of like almost an Americana like environment, and I think that to me feels like in reference to Texas Chainsaw, in reference to Halloween, in reference to those old 70s movies that like I said, by virtue of the way they had to shoot, like we're using these long takes, and expansive sort of backgrounds, like in tech, like in both. I keep mentioning these two films, but these two films I think are pivotal to both movies, is the original Halloween and Texas Chainsaw, because I think there's a lot of like stylistic similarities there. And I think they're emulating that in as much as they're emulating like the 80s or it's like, what is it, Michigan, right? They're in Michigan.
I think so. It's like Midwest somewhere, but you're right. It's like Everytown, USA. It's interesting because it totally is Americana, but it's a completely different kind of Americana than Texas Chainsaw is. Texas Chainsaw is kind of like, this abandoned South, like Americana of poverty, kind of like John Steinbeck almost,
right?
Type of thing. And it's like bourgeois Norman Rockwell if he had been working in like the 80s, maybe. I think, if Texas Chainsaw is to X, Halloween is to this, I think. It's got, a much more suburban milieu to it. There's just also something very dusky about the movie. You have, and part of that is the amazing long take that opens the movie, where we see a character who is not the main character, but who will be the victim that introduces us to the monster, running out of her house at like right at sundown, like right at dusk, and clacking across the street as the camera kind of follows her in like a 360 as she goes to find a car, and runs out of the neighborhood, or gets the hell out of Dodge. And it opens on this very Twilight scene, and it feels like the whole movie has not quite a nocturnal edge to it, but it feels very Twilighty to me, and that I maybe contributes to the sense of nostalgia that I'm reading into the movie. But it's also I feel like the characters are all very soft spoken. There's a lot of kind of quietness in the movie that is juxtaposed with these sequences of intense dread when you see the monster approaching you. And that's the other thing about the monster, and that's something that the shitty one night stand lays out for us, as well as Jay, when he tells her, okay, this is what's happening to you. He very clearly delineates the rules of the monster in the movie, right? In fact, I think if you like go on to YouTube and search up the scene, like the name of the scene as attributed to like movie clips, or it might even say on the DVD, is like learning the rules, which is a very meta injection into a horror movie. But one of the rules, anyway, sorry to digress, but one of the rules is that it walks. It does not run. It always walks. So it's this very slow force that its biggest power is it just kind of wears you down. It doesn't chase you. It doesn't, it doesn't come running after you with a club or a machete. It's just this ominous stalking figure that you can easily run away with. Well, that'd be a different movie. You can easily run away from, but you'll get tired eventually, and it'll just keep coming for you. So I feel like there's, this theme of slowness or quiet, or not a theme, but this motif kind of gets repeated through the movie in a way that makes it extra uncanny for me. There's something, what's so scary about this movie is just how almost sleepy it is in a lot of its segments.
Yeah, I think that goes into sort of that sort of autumnal presence that you were talking about. It feels like it's a Halloween movie. It feels like fall. It feels like Mr. Winterman with his pumpkin spice latte and sweater. Like, it's a horror movie for him,
Yeah, totally. It's like all the best Halloween movies, it has that seasonal vibe to it. Which is not entirely lost from, I was going to try to compare it to X, but X has like a very distinctly summer vibe, right? It's very summer of love. It's very sweltering. We need an excuse to have as few clothes on as possible. Right. The heat of the body juxtaposed to the heat of the atmosphere. That's all very X, which was, to keep going back to the Texas Chainsaw comparison, that's also very Texas Chainsaw, sort of the texture of humidity in the air. Everybody's fucking sweating like crazy. Everything just looks slick and gross and way too hot. It looks like an unpleasant place to be. The other thing that connects these movies that I didn't really think about consciously at first, but the more I was thinking about the horror factor of both of the movies and where sort of the grotesque lies in both of these movies. I mean, let's just go over the monster essentially, right? We already talked about the It Follows monster. It is a shapeshifter. It takes the form of anybody. It could be somebody that you know. It could be somebody that you don't. It could be a face in the crowd. Most horrifically, it takes the form of the main character's dead dad at the end, right? Is he dead or is he just gone? I don't remember. Is it ever made explicitly clear?
I don't think so. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, she has this like traumatized reaction to it. But anyway, it's this shapeshifter, right? But it's I think interesting to note the forms that it appears under, because as spectators, right, we're sensitive to certain things. There are certain things that are just inherently creepier, and those are the things that the monster takes the forms of. So of course, there's the one with the guy who's impossibly big. He looks like a circus performer, right? Like he's like crazy scary in that scene, especially because he like emerges out of nowhere and has to like hunch over to get through the doorway. But I like the other forms that it takes. I think one of the most memorable forms is this scary old woman, right?
With the hospital gown.
With the hospital gown, exactly. And of course, then it'll take on the appearance of like a scary child, which is another horror trope. But the scary older woman sat with me partially because of how we pair this with X, which also bases a lot of Brian already knows where I'm going. You probably do too. Which also bases a lot of its sort of like grotesque, high impact aesthetic horror in just like old people are fucking scary. Specifically, the idea of old people connected to sex is fucking scary. But we can we'll get into that, I think, a little bit more acutely with X. I mean, what do you take away, Brian, from like the forms that the monster assumes in this movie? I mean, could it have been anything and it would have been scary? Is it the performance? Is it like the archetype that it fulfills?
I think it's the slow walk and the dead stare. Again, not to keep bringing this up, but like it evokes Michael Myers, and it evokes Jason too. Just that faceless nothingness is what's so scary. And all of those performers like get that across really well. And I think it's only the tall guy who looks like he's like pale, because I feel like you could almost imagine that they're a lot like, obviously it's some sort of like weird spirit or ghost, but like with the exception of, I think the tall guy had like this real pale face, but most of them looked like they would fit in if others were seeing them.
I think the only one other exception is the kid that like attacks them when they're in the boathouse. They're at the beach and they lock themselves in the boathouse and it changes shape. It's like this little, like he looks like he's like an 11-year-old boy or something with a very close cropped haircut. And super dark bags under his eyes. And that's also the only time I think where the monster like screams. Like he like breaks his hand in through the door and goes like, rah! But other than that, you're right. He's like the it is totally placid. It's totally slow, which makes that opening scene all the more fucking terrifying, because immediately after, we have that long take where this unnamed woman is like fleeing her house from the unseen it that follows. We have this really harsh cut to her mangled corpse. In like a really, a long shot. You see it's almost kind of diminished in the frame, but you see she's like lying on her back with her leg fucking snapped in half and bent towards her face in, this really unnatural way that, it denotes a certain kind of like insane force, some real brutal assault that is like it forces you to fill in those gaps, because you see the thing that follows people, which I'm totally going to keep referring to this monster as the it that follows. But I
think they call it the entity, if that's
the entity. Yeah,
that feels dumb.
That's better. Well, it's better than saying the it that follows. But you kind of fill in those gaps, because every time you see the entity, it's slow moving. It looks completely dispassionate. It's like this thing It doesn't have a personal vendetta. It's just this like slow haunt. It's like mortality itself. And then you're like, well, what the hell does this do when it gets you? You don't really see it attacking anybody, I don't think. You see that one really, really grisly aftermath, and you see how insistent it is on pursuing these people, but it leaves that big question mark in your mind. It's like, well, what the hell is this thing going to do when it gets to you? It makes me think of if you've ever played like a horror video game, you might have the same reaction where the game is really scary until you start losing a bunch of times. And then you're like, okay, well, I've seen myself get disemboweled this many times. The mystery is, the jig is up, right? I know what the killer is going to do to me if I get caught. It's not as scary. And leaving you in the dark about what actually happens between getting caught by this thing and being found on the beach, that to me was really scary when I saw this for the first time.
I think that's another thing that makes it effective, because it's that fear of the unknown. Michael Myers is 9 times out of 10, he's going to stab you. Freddy was always my favorite. That was always my favorite.
Freddy's got an imagination on him.
Nightmare was always my favorite franchise because they were like the most interesting. Like the deaths were always really cool. And Michael Myers, like the Halloween and the Friday the 13th franchises, I didn't like as much. But anyway, I'm getting off track. What was I saying? Oh, but it's that fear of the unknown. And again, in great horror, like what you don't see is scarier than what you see. I don't know if you ever saw The Mist.
Oh, totally.
I read that book. I'm a huge Stephen King fan. And I remember reading that book and I was real excited for that movie. But then the movie came out and you could see so much of this like dopey CGI that I was like, this ruined it. Like the book is fantastic. It's like not even a book, it's like a novella, I think.
Do you not get a sense of like what the creatures look like in the book? Do you not, or like what the hell's coming from the mist?
I mean, it's Stephen King, so he's describing in very gross detail like what's being done. Like the bodies get thrown back or something, but they don't really know what it is, if memory serves. It's also been a long time since I've read it, but I remember being disappointed that the movie's ending was terrible, which is a whole other conversation.
Everybody loves the ending to that movie.
Oh, it's a cruel, cruel ending.
It is. I can't disagree with you there. It is very cruel.
And again, the book's ending, I always loved the book's ending too. The book's ending was very ambiguous.
How does the book end?
Well, it's all done in first person. So it's like a first person account. So it ends with the Thomas Jane character. I don't remember his name now, but so everything was happening in the first person. So he's been writing. And so he's like, I'm leaving at this hotel. This is where we're going. This is what we hope to see. Like, end of my story. I just wanted to share it with somebody. And so I always like that ambiguity.
That's crazy. Cause I mean, the ending of The Mist is what most people quote when you ask them about. Anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, So today we're comparing The Mist and It Follows.
We can absolutely do The Mist at some point. I want to do a Stephen King episode.
I mean, getting to the topic of mystery and ambiguity, I think that is honestly as good a segue as ever for our more X-centric portion of the pod. Just because I have some thoughts on that. Is there anything else about It Follows specifically? I mean, I'm sure we're going to be throwing back and forth to it, but while we're still laser focused on It Follows, except for digressions to The Mist, is there anything else about the movie that you wanted to cover?
No. Like I said, I think this is one of my favorite horror films of the last several years. It's one that I visit every Halloween. And I'm happy that we came on to talk about it because I love this movie and I'm excited to dig into X, which is very much more recent, and I haven't seen it as many times, but I've also seen it more recently. Yeah. So
I guess the only thing that I would add on to It Follows, I don't have a lot to say about it, but I love its version of the final girl. And I think that she has some really good friends.
Yeah. Oh, and
she tells them what's going on, and they're like, "All right, let's solve it." And they get together and they solve it.
And also, I wanted to just say, because I just talked about the ending of The Mist in the book form. Speaking of ambiguous endings, I love the ending of It Follows,
Oh
where
yeah,
because you've been so primed, to, like we talked about, like to watch the background, and you're like, is this the creature? Is this the entity? Are they being followed, or is this really over for them? And you
right.
don't know.
We have that great tracking shot at the end as we see, crucially from behind, we see Jay and her friends, I think, walking down
Yeah.
the sidewalk, and the movie just ends with this tracking shot following her. And you're right. It's like, oh, are we supposed to be in a POV of something like more sinister? Is this supposed to indicate that it's not over, or is it totally innocuous?
Exactly.
Yeah, very creepy.
Okay, we can hop over to talk about X. I'm going to play the trailer for X, and then we'll meet you on the other side.
Farmer's daughter, take one. I need to be famous, Wayne. All the best people are.
There ain't nobody else out there like you.
You know why?
Why?
Because you got that X Factor. Our days of struggling may soon be over.
Hollywood, here we come.
So this is it. Our own studio backlot.
You're looking for a place to stay.
Oh, yes, sir.
That's one ugly son of a bitch. And my wife, Pearl, is next door. So I would appreciate a little discretion.
He don't know what we're doing, does he?
Well, it's better to beg for forgiveness and ask for permission.
Would you like to come inside?
Much obliged.
I want to be in the movie.
Well, you can't. The story can't just change midway through.
If Daddy catches us, there's no telling what he might do.
My wife is not well. It happens after dark.
Maxine? You don't want to leave, do you?
People's eyes are gonna pop out of their damn skulls when they see this. What?
Are you all right?
No.
One of the boys found this inside.
What do you think is on it?
I see one goddamn fucked up horror picture.
All right, welcome back. That was the trailer for X, which I definitely also heard right along with you just now. I actually haven't even watched the trailer yet. I don't know what it's going to look like, but so that'll be fun. Yeah, so Ty West. This is another one that I'm glad we talked about, because Ty West, I think, between this, I have yet to see Pearl, but between this and House of the Devil has made, I think, two really fantastic horror films.
So I will confess to being a Ty West newbie. I still have not seen House of the Devil. I did see Pearl, and I have thoughts on Pearl, especially in conjunction with X. Very curious to see what Max 616 is going to be like, his third one in the X trilogy that is supposed to be, appropriately enough, retro 80s themed. Didn't he also do a short on the ABCs of Death? I don't remember which one he did.
Maybe?
Yeah, I think he, far be it for me to say he got a start with the ABCs of Death, but that was, I think, definitely earlier in his filmography. No, he's got other stuff going on before that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so what do you see? I mean, I'm curious because I hadn't seen House of the Devil, and I know that was sort of his launch pad. What do you see in as far as like stylistic similarities between this movie and that one?
They're both heavily steeped in. They're both very, like we were talking about, very much an homage to an earlier style of filmmaking, an earlier style of horror filmmaking, like your John Carpenter and your Wes Craven, Tobe Hooper, and I mean, House of the Devil, when it came out, I want to say it was like 2009. I remember Blu-rays were still kind of taking off, but enough people still had VHS tapes that they released it on VHS. I have no idea how it did, but I remember reading about that and it was perfect because it has that feeling of a movie you rented in the 80s. Like, it's the same thing. It's like very retro, a lot of long takes, a lot of just like sense of dread and foreboding. Although in both cases, like an ample amount of jump scares as well, but very much in that vein.
Does he try to emulate at all the visual grain of the 80s? Because that's the other thing that I've noticed with both X and Pearl is that it's definitely a send up of their respective eras. For X, it's very, very conspicuously the 70s, and with Pearl, it's this weird like MGM Sweetheart kind of thing, like 30s 40s kind of deal. But it's set in, I think, the 19-teens. But both of those movies have a certain kind of aesthetic slickness that, to me, I was talking earlier about how X feels very emblematic of like the A24 aesthetic subgenre. It's a certain kind of like self-evident proficiency of craft, right? Like X at least at the very minimum. I can't speak for House of the Devil, but X is very, very confident in its camera work, and it's it's not trying to emulate this certain kind of like B movie aesthetic. It's definitely, maybe in the staging, maybe in the general conceit, but it's very sturdy as far as cinematography goes.
Yeah, I would say that's true of House of the Devil as well. And there's not a sense in House of the Devil, or to my mind, very much in X. To me, it doesn't seem to be emulating any of that genre of those films, and with like a wink or a joke or like a nudge in the elbow. It takes it very seriously, and I think that's one of the things too that I respond to because I'm also a fan of those other films, like I've been talking about. But yeah, like House of the Devil was set in the 80s, and I remember at the time reading about it, he was like, "Well, if I'd said it in the modern day, everyone would have had a cell phone and it wouldn't have been possible." So, and I love that too, like that practical approach to like, well, I have to set it in the 80s because then why don't you just pick up the phone is no longer a question.
Yeah. So why don't you give us a brief overview of what X is about? What's the plot? What's the premise?
Oh, geez. Well, the very bare bones plot is some adult film actors have rented a cabin out in the middle of nowhere. I don't remember where it is. But they get there and they learn that the cabin is owned by these two horny old people who aren't too happy.
We don't know that they're horny right off the bat.
Not off the bat, no.
I think the big twist.
Super creepy. Yeah, by the way, full spoilers.
I love that this movie can be described by saying that it has the twist is that the old people are horny. Yeah. Which is but anyway, so they
telegraph it like they are creepy from the get-go. The old man is introduced wielding a shotgun and trying to kill one of the he ends up being, I think, the porn producer. And then the mother is watching in the woods, watching the character as she's like skinny dipping. So they're introduced it's telegraphed very quickly that they're creepy old people more than they're like horny old people. But it seems at first that they're upset that all of the sex is happening in their cabin.
Yeah, you don't.
And that's
you're not sure what direction the creepiness is going. At first, I think because it is so in the style of these like 70s slashers where repression is the name of the game and sex is always punished. You're seeing these old people watch these, slender, muscular 70s sweaty young people, fuck like rabbits. And you're like, oh, they're going to kill them because, no sex on my property. These octogenarians are going to kill them. And there's also this ongoing kind of juxtaposition with like the radio news or the TV news or something talking about like the moral brigade against like pornography or against like pornographic stuff in TV and movies. So it's already, from the get-go, you were very cued in to know that this is a movie about sex. This is a movie about negative attitudes towards sex and, the liberatory celebration of sex in response to those negative attitudes. But you see these old people and you're like, are they going to kill them because they don't like that they're having sex on their property? And the eventual answer that the movie gives you is, no, they want to get in on it. Like they have this kind of, it's implied that it's like this longstanding tradition that they bait young people onto their property and rent out this cabin adjacent to their house. And what do they do? They like have sex with them, they imprison them, they kill them. Yeah. The big reveal of the movie, right, is that these old people are not as docile as they seem, both in the sense that they will kill you, but also in the sense that they'll like climb into bed with you and start fondling you, which is let's talk about that. I said before, I guess I'm just sort of diving into the deep end here with, what do I make of this movie's point? And it's interesting because the movie definitely seems to be a conscious response to this kind of like ingrained moralism that we see in slashers that Brian brought up before, right? It's the rule in horror movies that is parodied by Scream and parodied by parodies of Scream, like Scary Movie. The whole point being that if you have sex, you're going to die. If you do drugs, you're going to die. In the sense that the killer is this kind of corrective for teens behaving badly. And in this movie, it seems to be very much buying into that era-specific moralism while showing it in kind of like a parodic light, or at least pushing against it in some way. This notion that the slut will prevail, basically. And it's ultimately where I come down on it is that, even though the movie sort of ends with this affirmation that desire, does not merit you having your head chopped off, it felt kind of weird to me that the center point of monstrosity in this movie was, to paraphrase a Letterboxd reviewer that I saw, old people having missionary sex. They are grotesquely old. They are the effects makeup is really great. They are pockmarked, they're wrinkled. They're not just old, they're like decrepit. They're really disgusting to look at. And it makes the sex scenes feel more like these characters are having sex with a zombie, which is just inherently grotesque and monstrous. But the implication, my thing, and I'll shut up in a second, but my thing with this movie is that it has so many balls in the air, so many geriatric balls in the air, and I don't know where it comes down on any of them, and that's what stuck this movie in my mind as both kind of like unsatisfying but really fascinating, because it raises all of these questions, it thematizes all of these things, but it never really does anything with any of them. It gets a hell of a lot of mileage out of the aesthetics of the 70s and some really expertly crafted kills, but by the end of the movie I wasn't really sure what the old people were doing. I wasn't sure. I was telling Brian, I was kind of disappointed actually when Pearl came out, because it basically provides a backstory to the grandma in X. It shows her in the 1910s as a teenager or a young 20-something who her biggest thing is that she lives in morally repressive times. She can't have a boyfriend. She can't have sex. She can't be a star. And that to me kind of, cinched the knot on what X was proposing, where it's like, it wasn't entirely clear why these people were doing this. And in fact, there were several parts in X where I was like, is this a queerness thing? Because notably, the grandma has several I won't even say sexually charged scenes, but several, sexual scenes with the girls in the movie. And it's not entirely clear if this is like a lust for the concept of youth. You see her as, kind of like an old mirror version of these young women. So is it just that she's desirous of their youth, or is she desirous of them? And then you're like, okay, well, if she had this whole arrangement with her husband, was her husband getting some dick on the side? Like, was this a way of them, accessing, albeit grotesquely, a certain kind of sexual liberation that they weren't afforded in their old age? It's not really clear. And then Pearl comes out and says, no, it's just because she wasn't allowed to get dick down when she was a teenager. So, but anyway, there's so many things about sexual lib and sexual repression in this movie. Brian, I have already spewed my nonsense. What did you take away from this movie in terms of its sexual politics and where it stands, like vis-a-vis the sexual politics of, the 70s slasher movie, of the horror movie?
I feel like you asked 7 different questions there, and I have to like.
Well, just like X, I threw a lot of shit in the air.
So my initial takeaway, I've only seen it. I've seen it twice now. The first time I saw it was less than a month ago, and I really liked it. Well, I guess in terms of what was my takeaway in terms of its sexual politics, actually, I think the fact that I saw this, and I watched this and I kept thinking of It Follows. And that was what's kind of got me thinking about pairing these two, because they both seemed, on one hand, they have that style of filmmaking that is like reflective of this era of horror films. And like I said, they take that like sex is bad literally, just in the story of the films. And so it seems to me at its most basic reading, they're punishing them for making porn and having sex and living these degenerate lives. They're murdering them because they disapprove of their lifestyle. That's what I think. And you're right. To me, it was telegraphed early on when they walk into that convenience store and like the clerk is giving them the dirty looks, and there's that like televangelist on TV, and he's talking about how terrible sex is. So to me, that was the big takeaway. It's interesting to me. I've read enough about Pearl. I haven't seen it, but it does seem to me that it seeks to sort of justify why she was doing this. And it's interesting that you mentioned how she has these sort of mirror relationships with the girls, and it bears mentioning that Mia Goth plays the old lady. And,
I
don't have the characters' names in front of me, but she also plays one of the young girls. So there's a literal like. And
there's also this way in which the movie kind of leaves it ambiguous. It's this big question mark. I don't remember how this is telegraphed or how this is communicated in the movie, but there's this point where you're kind of like, you see the old woman as a young woman, and you're like, oh, that's Mia Goth. Like,
yeah.
Hey, wait a second. And it's not entirely clear if it's just supposed to be this sort of like meta film trick to make you sort of get into the old woman's headspace and see that she sees this woman as herself at a younger age, or if there's some weird, supernatural things like that is her, this is like a reincarnation of her. It doesn't really, that's not really explored. It's not really a diegetic mystery, but it is this one moment in the film of the uncanny where you're like, wait a second, that's Mia Goth. That's the main character.
Yeah, I think that. So I don't know, and I don't know the backstory behind the making of the films, but to me, that would just seem to be more a function of she's playing her in the prequel. So I'm gonna for this, I'm gonna make her up, and she's gonna play both roles because she's unrecognizable as the old lady. And it's only in that scene where you're made aware of it, the one you mentioned. And so I don't know if that's a character choice that they made in the writing or if it was a casting choice that they made.
Well, it does seem that Mia Goth is really involved in this, almost a trilogy. It will be a trilogy pretty soon. In this trilogy's making, it sounds like she and Ty West kind of really bonded over the character of Pearl and whatever her surrogate character in X is. And she, I believe, is credited as a co-writer on Pearl. We can edit that out if I'm wrong. I'm going to double check that really quickly. But I mean, in both of those movies, Mia Goth just steals the show. She is so amazing, and part of what makes her so fun to watch, especially in Pearl, because that's it's fresh in my mind right now, is this like affectation towards camp excess, which I think Ty Goth is kind of going for in both of the movies. Definitely more conspicuously in Pearl, since it's supposed to be the send up of Judy Garland era melodramas. But I don't know. Did you find X campy at all?
No, not particularly. No, I wouldn't say so. I will say though that my favorite we were talking about Mia Goth. I wanted to mention my favorite performance in the movie is Brittany Snow. I think she's fantastic, and Kid Cudi, who, by the way, I was like, just show his dick. Come on, just show his dick. You're showing us all this blood and gore. Come on.
Brittany Snow, by the way, wasn't she Amber in Hairspray?
She was.
There you go. There's a piece of pie connection, bona fide.
Perfect. I liked her a lot in this movie.
Yeah.
And the like when Harry Met Sally scene where she's like on the bed and he's just standing there in the window and he's like all proud that he just fucked her, and she's just like, no, that was acting, and then she fakes an orgasm.
One of my favorite things about this movie is like the entire first half. The buildup is pretty slow, and for most of the first half of the movie, I think we are getting these like intimations of horror. We're getting this general sense that the place where they're staying is creepy. But so much of it is just sort of this tension between the characters in the studio, including the performer and the performer who's Brittany Snow, and Mia Goth, who is at first just kind of like, what is she, the sound girl, the camera girl? No,
isn't that the sound girl is the girl from Scream, and she's playing Wednesday Addams.
Well, so the first half of the movie, right, is this. It's closer to like a character drama, and I was really hooked just following the tensions between these characters and seeing which one, how they were trying to navigate this sort of sexual fluidity, which some were comfortable with, some kind of weren't. And that in and of itself was already kind of tense and horrific. And then, stuff starts popping off in the second half. But it's a slow build, I thought.
Jenna Ortega is the sound girl.
Jenna Ortega. Wait, so am I tripping? Who's Mia Goth playing this?
Mia Goth is Maxine, yeah. She's the one who's in the convenience store with her. She's fucking the producer.
Oh, right. Okay.
And the sound girl is
Jenna Ortega.
Jenna Ortega from Wednesday and Scream.
Gotcha.
They do look a lot alike. So I'm sure you're not the first to make that. But yes. Yeah. So yeah. Does that like completely, now you're like, I have to completely reevaluate this movie now?
Well, now I'm like, no, not so much, I guess. Because it's not just that it maps onto the actress, the actors themselves. I just thought there was a really interesting interplay between this sort of like timid character played by, now I know, Jenna Ortega, and sort of the threat that sexual liberation poses on the set, because initially it is something that's very intimidating and kind of frightening to her, and not just in like timid mouse doesn't want to do this, but kind of, I think the movie shows us valid reasons why this is sketchy. I mean, this whole production is they're this group of cohorts, but they're very fly by night. They're reckless young adults, basically, and she's the only one who seems to have her head firmly on her shoulders. But what's interesting is she wants to star in the movies eventually, right?
Yeah.
Like she sort of takes it on herself and becomes inspired by what she sees on set. And her evolution, I think, is so cool for a final girl. I think she was really, really fun to watch, and her character development was great.
Yeah. Yeah, I like her a lot. I liked her in Scream, too. She was good in Scream.
Who was she in Scream? She was
the sister that gets stabbed.
Yes.
Melissa Barrera's sister.
Yeah.
Like the lead sister or whatever.
Yeah.
And now
What?
she's Wednesday Addams.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So I'd like to talk about X's. I mean, we already sort of talked about what makes X grotesque.
Yeah.
Or at least
But I want to say, though, that
Yeah.
just to go back to Mia Goth and Pearl, and those two characters, I do think that there's something to be, because she is already she comes in, she's like done adult movies, she's the first time she's a stripper, she's doing coke. In a lot of ways, I think a case could be made that Pearl is just sort of jealous and is like, wish that she could have had, like, she has the life that Pearl wished she could have had. She wishes she could have been sexually liberated and been adventurous and lived in a different time. And maybe she's punishing them for that.
Well, I'll leave it up to you to form your own opinion on Pearl. But I think, with that prequel, Ty West, he provides a lot of explainer notes for X, which I mean, it was really cool seeing this whole kind of 30s pastiche as an evolution or a next step from the 70s pastiche of the first movie. Mia Goth is so amazing in that movie. I've seen a bunch of memes going around about her performance, and every time I watch them, I kind of tear up a little bit because she's actually very heart-wrenching in that movie. But yeah, I was a little bit disappointed by the follow-up in terms of how many gaps it filled in. So even though I was a little bit disappointed with how much felt unresolved, or at least they didn't really think through what they were trying to say in X. There was something about that unresolvability that made it enticing to me. It's, it's like you said with It Follows. It doesn't really track onto any one thing. It just sort of puts these ideas out there. And I want to go back to the element of horror in this movie, because, right, we talked about what made It Follows so scary just from, a audiovisual standpoint. Did you find X scary? What's the locus of emotion in this movie?
I think
kind of campy.
There was a sense of dread throughout, a sense of sort of like what's going to happen, because I mean the movie opens with that's another similarity with Texas Chainsaw, because Texas Chainsaw famously opens and there's those shots of the photographers and the police and everything. The movie opens with police investigating like what we will soon see be the murder scene. So that gives you that sense of like these people, of sort of a foreboding that these people aren't long for this world. And of course you're watching a horror movie, and so you're excited, and you kind of can't wait to see. Because like we watch a horror movie, like in a lot of ways, it's like we know a lot of people are going to be brutally murdered for our entertainment. And so it creates the sense of like kind of trying to figure this out, like in the suspense of like the scene when she's in the lake and there's that alligator. The alligator doesn't, I'm sure I heard the alligator shows up in Pearl. And there's
the alligator shows
there.
up very early on in Pearl in a moment that is almost tailor-made for you to get up and clap. Like it's very that's the other thing with Pearl, is that it felt very, I'm like worried that Ty West is turning this into a cinematic universe, which is upsetting. But yeah, the alligators in Pearl.
No, but so that's the sense of like it's really tense, and like there's a lot of scenes early on where it's shot in such a way where you think something's going to happen, and then maybe it does or it doesn't. But it's that constant sense of unease that
That's right. You have that great overhead shot of the alligator like slowly closing in on what's her face. It's just it's a great shot.
Yeah. Just stuff like that. And like that was what I took away from it. And because that's my kind of like I was saying, that's my favorite kind of horror film where you're just constantly on edge. You don't really know what's going to happen. Anything could happen, and so it's exciting.
Well, to pair with that, one of the things that I really liked about X is kind of the inverse, or the scenes where you knew exactly what was going to happen, but the movie kind of teases you a little bit. The one that I remember is the kill in the barn, where I don't even remember who gets killed, but I think it's one of the guys. He is locked in the barn, and he like lowers his eye to this hole in the door, and you've already seen prior that the old lady, that Pearl, is out there with like a pitchfork. And with these juxtapositions of shots, and you're like, oh no, you just do it. And the movie like holds on it for so long. And of course, exactly what you think is going to happen happens. He gets a pitchfork through the eye, and it's incredibly gross and brutal. But there's something about the way that the movie plays with your expectations in both directions that is really fun. And that's where I keep landing on this movie, is that it is clearly made by somebody who loves movies. I think that much is clear. Ti West is very into both movie history and sort of the clever, like, nothing up my sleeve kind of magician's approach to filmmaking. Right. That is one thing I think everybody can agree on. He had a ball making these two movies. That's
like literally was my Letterboxd review, was that and honestly, I don't think I rated it very high. I wrote it and posted it right after I saw it. As time has passed and I've seen it again, I'm a little kinder to it. I'd probably raise it by, I think I gave it 2.5. I think I'd probably raise it to 3. Anyway, but it was just that like, there's no surprises to the story. You know exactly what's going to happen, but it's made with this love of the craft, and that elevates it, I think, to not that it's elevated horror. I think the craftsmanship makes it stand out, and he's such a good filmmaker, and he's so able to not just emulate and borrow from those movies, but make it his own, which I think is the key to being a good filmmaker. Well, what's the saying? Like a good artist, a good writer steals, a bad writer borrows, or something like that.
Yeah, a bad writer steals, a good writer borrows. I think something like that. I keep returning to, like, I'm thinking back to my theater experience with this, and in the same way that I like wanted to zero in on, what were the conditions for first seeing It Follows. I'm curious what your first, what was going on that day when you went to go see X? Because for me, I remember it came out to like very little fanfare. It was something that I saw was playing. I had heard kind of interesting things about. I remember it came out with like very little ceremony. I hadn't heard about it prior. Then again, I also, like I said, I didn't really know Ti West, so I wasn't anticipating it or anything. But I went to go see it at the Draft House with a couple of friends, and we all kind of like walked out, not really sure what to make of it, but knowing that, knowing that it wasn't something, you go in to see some, dime a dozen horror movie. There's, I'm pretty harsh on this movie, and I think Ti West's ambitions for the trilogy, but I can't deny that there's something about this movie that feels singularly auteurish, right? So what was your sort of list of expectations going?
Well, to be honest, X kind of came and went under my radar. But I remember Pearl was heavily advertised to me for some reason, and I was like, oh my god, it's the movie it's Ti West, who did House of the Devil, but I didn't like. He did a movie called The Innkeepers, which I didn't like. And then in the trailer, in the commercial, it mentions X, and I was like, oh, okay. So I went back and looked that up, and I watched it. Like I said, I watched it for the first time very recently. I watched it right here on this couch on, I think it was Showtime. And I watched it because I knew it was a Ti West movie, and I wanted to see it. And I didn't, like I said, I don't know how it escaped my notice when it came out. I feel like it came out early this year, right? Like it's all been in the same year.
Yeah, X came out I think in like February, which is all the more, there's been this whole thing around Pearl. I remember when that also released with like almost no notice. Everybody was like, they were making a prequel to this movie that came out in February that was not really showing any franchise ambitions. It was just very weird.
Yeah.
The whole situation was strange. So that's interesting. So you went back and saw X only after it was advertised vis-a-vis Pearl.
Yeah. And I work a lot. I have a very busy schedule, and it's difficult for me to make time to go see movies. And actually last week I had I was going to a movie and I was like, I can either see Pearl or Barbarian. And Barbarian was starting sooner. So I saw that.
We got to have a whole episode. Well, I mean, speaking of gerontophobia, I mean, I feel like that's the hot topic these days. Everybody's afraid of fucking old naked ladies.
I was thinking
spoilers to anybody who hasn't seen Barbarian. I won't say anything more.
I was thinking that when you were talking about the old ladies and the cuddling scene or whatever, I was like, oh yeah, that's like right out. Like I just watched Barbarian and
Mommy's scary.
Yeah,
it's as simple as that. Mommy's scary. Well, and also, I mean, there's been kind of this reverberation for both of these movies for me because another two movies that came out in sort of close conjunction with each other, Barbarian and Smile. And Barbarian made me think a lot of X because it's got sort of this similar, fear of sexual old women. Although I guess she's not really. I won't say anything more. But and Smile has the same. It's so many people have compared it to It Follows. It's got the same kind of haunt structure in that you have this haunting that is communicable by some kind of intimate exposure. In the case of Smile, it's basically by witnessing acute trauma. And it's, I guess, probably the better predecessor to both of these films is The Ring. Right.
Yeah.
It's this thing. It's this curse that is heavily based in like urban legend in the sense of, spam mail. Right. Pass this on and you will not be harmed. But you have to pass it on. You have to inflict it on somebody else. And Smile. I mean, it made me think of It Follows in the same way that Barbarian made me think of X. And I'm wondering, I don't know. I just felt like this uncanny moment of, the same things rattling around in the zeitgeist.
I wanted to see Smile too. The reason Smile wasn't an option that day was that it wasn't at the theater that I was nearest. I was looking it up online. I was like, I don't know if you know City North.
Oh yeah.
Like Diversity in Western.
Mm-hmm.
I was over in that area.
Okay. I've had a couple friends at this point tell me that I way overhyped Smile.
I really want to see it. I'm excited to see it. I want to see it.
I loved that movie. To me, it's the perfect kind of like haunted house Halloween movie. It's got it's got a lot of jump scares. So I don't know if that's if it's really your.
I do like the jump scare too. Like I like jump scares. I just don't like horror movies that are only jump scares and have nothing else to offer.
No,
to me, like the jump scare comes from you have that constant sense of foreboding, and then you jump because suddenly something has happened that, you know what I mean? Like the jump scare where it's not just like, oh, but he's standing behind the corner.
And what I love about Smile, and actually another thing that sort of links it back to It Follows, is it trains you to look in the background, right? Yeah. Smile. So
what I'm hearing is I mixed up the pairings. I should have done It Follows and Smile and.
Well, no, it's
X.
almost like the pairings should be It Follows and X to Smile and Barbarian. It's just in that they both sort of the pairings are paired.
That makes sense. Yes. Well, next time.
Yeah, but I don't want to overhype Smile because clearly I've done that before. I fucking loved that movie, but it is. I mean, it's serviceable. It's not, and this sort of goes hand in hand with what I was saying earlier about this need for horror movies to be on trend with like this elevatedness to them. Horror movies can't just be horror movies. Well, and it's like you said, all horror movies are intrinsically about something, but horror movies have become, I think, kind of like neurotically pressured to be about something greater than themselves in a very self-conscious way. And Smile is not. I mean, there are some parts where it kind of gestures at being about, everybody's favorite word these days, trauma, which is, if you've seen all of those interviews with Jamie Lee Curtis about the new Halloween movies, you'll know that she loves saying trauma, or she pronounces it trauma. It's just kind of like a really good, screamer. It kind of reminds me of those the maze game that you would play on your computer in middle school, or that I would play on my computer in middle school, where the Exorcist face jumps out at you at the very end. It's a thrill ride, like, for sure, but it is very good at like training you to expect the worst, so that some of the scariest scenes in that movie were scenes where absolutely fucking nothing happened.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know. I will say, going back quickly to It Follows, there are, and to link it back to Barbarian as well, there are two moments in recent history that I can recall a horror movie making me audibly scream. One of them was It Follows, the big tall guy. Also because at the time, I worked with a guy that was super tall and kind of like didn't look exactly like that, but like did not look like that either. So it was like extra creepy. And have you seen Barbarian? So it was the scene when Bill Skarsgård comes crawling out of the dark.
Oh, that was freaky. Well,
for some reason that just, I was like, ah!
To me, the follow-up scene where the lady comes right after him, like, scared the fuck out.
That whole scene. Yeah. But like that, I feel like I had already just screamed, so I was still kind of like calming down, and then that happened again. But like, yeah, for sure. That was a great scene. That was fantastic. Anyway, we got way off track. I don't even know now. Are we talking about Smile and Barbarian? did we change episodes halfway through an episode?
It's a broad gaslighting campaign. You've been listening to Smile X Barbarian this whole time. I feel like we've talked about what we wanted to when we set out at the beginning regarding X and It Follows in conversation. I guess I just want to circle back on that that general theming that ties both of them together of sex negativity, or at least like a modernist take on the tradition of sex negativity in horror. And I'm gonna go back to the question that I asked you at the top of our X discussion. Where do you think X falls on that axis? What is it? What do you take away from it in terms of its messaging around sexual? I don't even know to say sexual politics, sexual representation, because at the end of the day, it's like we said, Ty West is primarily engaged with movies. X is a referent to the movies of the 70s more than it is a referent to the culture of the 70s, I think. What do you make of X's, message? If we want to,
that's an interesting way to look at it, because then you could even say that because those movies commented on their time, and so to comment on these movies is invariably a comment on the time, right?
Well, yes, but it reminds me of Godard had this, or no, I don't think it was Godard who said this, but it was like emblematic of Godard's approach. Him and his whole cohort of people who were growing up, and they were the first generation to make movies who were also raised on movies. So they had movies as their primary social referent for life. And there's this quote, don't remember if it's Andre Bazin or who said it, that crime is no longer a socioeconomic phenomenon, it's a film genre. So when you're making films and you're making films about crime, you're referencing previous films about crime. You're not referencing, crime exists in the real world, we're going to make a movie about it. You're referencing crime films, crime as an aesthetic and narratological genre. And that, I feel like that's what I'm trying to like get to the heart of with Ty West and with X, is it's like, is it reflective of the 70s, or is it reflective of the 70s as they are portrayed in movies?
I would say it's the latter. The question of whether or not it is in reference to like I said, I think that making a movie that is in reference to Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre is also referencing and making a point of that era in the same way that now we're making. I love that quote. It's no longer a socioeconomic problem. It's a crime. It's a film genre. Like that, to me, we're in a space or place in our culture too, where everything is so, it's that like snake eating itself, and we have not only our movies, remakes and sequels and requels and reboots of other franchises, and there's going to be a new James Bond and more Star Wars, but like even our like fucking cookies are made to taste like other things. It'll be like a Kit Kat Oreo. Like, why do I need a Kit Kat Oreo? Yeah. Everything is in reference to itself. And so with that in mind, I don't think that I can single out like X as being self-referential to the 70s, which it clearly is. Like it clearly is not is, and this is the other thing we didn't really talk about. It's also sort of in reference and in conversation with 70s porn films, because the sex scenes are shot on like 16 millimeter, whatever it is. And they have that, or at least they're digitally created to look like that. I don't know if they shot it that way or not. I would imagine, though, knowing Ty West, that he probably did, but I don't know.
He's a nerd.
So, yeah, but he's probably like, he's a film nerd, right? And he's like, I'm going to shoot this on film. I would imagine. Again, I don't know. I could look it up and find out it was all in digital and that I'm an idiot. But like I'm saying, so it's hard to like look at it in those terms. And I'm at a point in my life and my like movie going habits that I like a horror movie to fill me with that sense of existential dread. I like the artificiality of it because I'm constantly filled with existential dread all the time. And I want to watch a 2-hour movie where there's a catharsis and an end to it. And so I'm getting way off track and kind of rambling, but at the end of the day, I keep thinking about this quote from John Carpenter where they were asking him about elevated horror, and he was basically like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh my God. Yeah. Was that in the AV Club interview?
Yeah.
That was so fucking, I love that man so much.
Yeah. And I feel the same way where I'm like, I feel like horror films have always been about something, and the best ones are. And to say that that's a new phenomenon or that's an A24 phenomenon, I think A24 does have a certain package that that their movies are released in, but they don't have they didn't invent a metaphor. That's why
I keep abusing the words self-consciously or conspicuously when talking about these things, because to me it really is. I agree. It's not that movies before this kind of packaging didn't have a message, they didn't have metaphors, they didn't have illusions. It's more that I think this sort of A24 genre of horror movie, or to put it in broader terms, like the elevated horror movie that we can chart as generally like gaining traction and popularity from the early to mid 2010s up to the present moment. What characterizes those for me is I think a lot of polish, and so that's why I commented on Ty West's craftsmanship, which is it's not a negative thing. It's that it's I guess honestly, essentially, it's movies that are made by film nerds that include a lot of sort of conspicuous referencing, a lot of it's really hard to chart out intention when it comes to what you receive as a spectator watching a movie. But I mean, in the same way, I feel like you could probably, like using the same logic, call Quentin Tarantino's movies elevated action movies, right? Because they're action movies about action movies. And there's,
exactly. I think that's like, exactly. Like,
yeah. Like if you've seen the newest Scream movie, there's an amazing. Have you seen that, Brian?
Mm-hmm.
There's
yes. That's how I knew Jenna Ortega was in it.
Oh, right, of course. But there's that hilarious opening sequence that mimics the opening sequence of the first one. Where the the young woman gets the call and she's talking about scary movies on the phone with the killer. But in this one, she says, "Oh, I don't know any of those movies. I only watch elevated horror like The Babadook." And he's like, "What's The Babadook? What's scary about that?" And she's like, "Well, it's kind of like this allegory for motherhood and like postpartum depression." And the killer on the line is like, "That's stupid. That's not real horror." Well, he doesn't say that, but he says something basically to the effect of, you know, it's not so regressive to be like, oh, these movies that thematize things for their horror are dumb, but it's this sort of, you know, as Scream has always done, it is this summarizing of the current moment of pop culture, and specifically the current moment in horror pop culture. And I think that, you know, that's right on the money. These days, a lot of, you know, what's in vogue for horror movies is this sense of they're very literary in the sense that they take other things as texts, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that they're smarter or that they are inherently about more than the horror movies of the, you know, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. But they seem more self-consciously about them. You know what I mean? They seem to be trying to put more into the messaging as opposed to latent messaging or, you know, using, I don't know. I guess to me, the big divide, and this is where I feel like it's kind of impossible to mark the split other than just kind of like an aesthetic or stylistic difference. But for me, it's the big thing of how obvious the movie makes it. And of course, everybody clowns on Aronofsky's mother. I think that's kind of like the the center point of like allegory for the sake of allegory. That movie is nothing but allegory. I like Mother, but I have to concede that it falls into my category of allegory for the sake of allegory.
Yeah. Well, I think I don't want to get too off the rails here, which I feel like we're already in danger of, but there's this sense, it seems to me, and I don't want to offend you or your generation, but it seems to me there's a talking about how you know, the character in Scream was like, well, I like Babadook because it's elevated horror and it's about something. And so she, and I'm going to use her as a very broad, I want to paint in very broad strokes, but I feel like she could represent this generation that thinks, like I said, that they invented things, that they invented metaphor, that they're the first ones to do a horror film that isn't just a guy in a mask, and it's the same culture of like everything is something else, where it's like they're making Oreos taste like Kit Kats and Kit Kats that taste like Oreos, and this
Oreo thing is really weighing heavy on you.
I just can't get over the like I don't even know if Oreo Kit Kats is real, but that was just a made up example. But the idea of like, I don't know. But then you have these people on like TikTok and things, and they go on TikTok and they're lip syncing someone else's joke that someone else wrote. And then they're like, when I wake up in the morning, and then they think they wrote the joke. You didn't write a joke. You heard a joke.
So I will go to bat for defending the TikTok things, because I think a lot of those actually are generative. They take a sound and then they reinterpret it in ways that were not originally intended by the sound, which I think is always very funny.
I think there's like 1% of that, and then 99% is like taking that exact quote and just using my face.
That's true. Well, and a lot of that is like, I'm hot, and that's the appeal of this video. I'm going to lip sync to that. But I agree. I really do think, and I think that character in Scream is like the perfect kind of, representation of this like zillennial archetype where, you know, it's not just that she says, oh, I don't know those old movies. There's like a layer of judgment in it. She's like,
I don't watch those movies.
Yeah, she's like, I don't watch those. I like smart horror movies. And that's what bugs me. And it sounds like, you know, you also about the term elevated horror, because it implies that horror before this was not sufficiently elevated. It wasn't sufficiently intellectual, or it wasn't clever enough. It wasn't literary enough. And that's just bullshit. But
they showed us Invasion of the Body Snatchers in college, in film school. These things have always been about something.
Well, and this is, you know, this might really threaten to veer into a different discussion, but I think like the best emblem of this is in the new Candyman movie by Nia DaCosta, I think. Let me double check that.
Yeah, no, that's correct.
Yeah, Nia DaCosta. I think I really loved that adaptation, but there's this one scene, or not even an adaptation. I mean, it's a yes anding of the original myth, which is what's so good about it. But there's this one scene, right, where the main character, he is a gallery artist, and he's at his gallery on the day that there is an art critic coming to assess his stuff, and he's kind of standing by his art while she's mutely assessing it, and like just kind of staring at it, intimidated, or in an intimidating way. And you can tell that he's really nervous. And so he starts explaining the meaning of his art. He starts saying, oh, well, so I did it this way because I wanted it to represent this. And if you see, yada, yada, that's meant to say that, X, Y, Z. And he starts just yammering. And then eventually he catches himself and he says, sorry, I guess I should probably just let the work speak for itself. And that to me is so emblematic of what's going on with these kind of like elevated horror movies. Some do pull it off really well. Some have just the right amount of sort of expository or explaining dialogue to match the mystery of everything else that they're putting in there. But so many of them feel like they consider themselves especially clever because they tell you in no uncertain terms what the movie means, and that drives me crazy. I feel like there's a lot that I can put up with in like a bad movie in terms of like, oh, the craft isn't all there, or oh, maybe it didn't really like stick the landing, maybe the tone was weird. But the thing that like really annoys me and gets me down on a movie is when it is clearly like sniffing its own farts, and it's like, oh, I am so goddamn smart and you are going to recognize me as so goddamn smart.
Yeah,
that drives me crazy.
Yeah.
And of course, there are varying levels of that. I think the biggest example of that to me, I think the most egregious offender is Halloween Kills. Oh my God, I hated that movie. I really, really did not like that movie.
I actually rewatched it before I watched Ends, and I'm glad I did because it made me sort of appreciate Ends more.
I've heard Ends is better. I still haven't seen it, but
I loved the first half.
Okay.
That's all I'm going to say.
Okay. I've already been, I think, mostly spoiled about it via Twitter, but I don't have as much investment in the Halloween franchise as I used to.
The first half feels like another 70s horror film riff. It feels it feels like it has shades of like Christine and this like nerdy character that is going through some shit. Okay. And there's like Stephen King elements to it. I felt like so the first half I loved, and then Michael Myers shows up, and I lost all interest.
So it all goes downhill when Michael shows up.
Yeah, I really felt like they could have done a Halloween 3 season of The Witch with this. Like it felt like they, for a moment, that's what they were trying to do. But then the market demands Michael Myers. So you got to put and the market, like, and you've set it up in such a way that like people want the final showdown that they're advertising, which by the way is like a teeny tiny portion of the movie.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Well, and then they'll probably revive him again. I mean, how many times have they done the fucking final showdown? They did that with the first of this like trilogy of requels, as they call them in the Scream movies. Yeah, I'm over it. Done.
But to go back to X and It Follows, did you have a say something gay about either of these movies?
A say something gay about X or It Follows. Well, so I think I've said my say something gay about both of them, or at least in terms of like the possible queer interpretation, because if we hadn't made it clear already, neither of these movies feel like inherently queer, but I think that there are queer glosses on both of them, both with sort of this this non-judgmental but still kind of scared horror around having multiple sexual partners in It Follows. And in X, like I said, like I was really waiting for them to unveil that this was like this kind of everything is allowed kind of hedonistic pansexual like murder spree that the two elderly people were on, and it wasn't. But I guess what I will say, I really the only say something gay thing that I really have is the self-incriminating sort of reiteration that I don't find old people fucking to be a scary concept, especially given my personal history. So I walked out of X being like, okay, I mean, like I wouldn't fuck those old people, but I don't find the concept particularly scary, so whatever.
I don't find the concept scary. I find their fingernails scary.
Yeah, they could use a visit to the derm doctor.
Yeah, and like just a barber.
You know what? Get them like a Korean facial scrub, and we'll talk about it.
I mean, we could all use a Korean facial scrub.
Yeah.
Honestly. I don't really. There's not. Yeah, you're right. There's not a lot gay going on in these movies, and when you were talking about Candyman, I was looking it up because I was trying to remember the actor's name. This is not a say something. This is a say something gay for Candyman.
we are allergic to talking about the movies on hand.
No, it's just you know what it is. It's an elevated podcast.
Oh, that's.
I was just looking at pictures of Yahya Abdul-Mateen II, and he's a beautiful.
He's fucking hot in that movie.
Yeah, he's hot. Period. There's no.
What else has he been in?
He was in a Michael Bay movie, and he was in The Trial of the Chicago 7.
Oh.
Aquaman, and he was Morpheus in the new Matrix.
Yeah. I just remember that in Candyman, all of his costuming could best be described as bicep forward. Yeah, that was appreciated.
I did mean to. Kid Cudi. Kid Cudi's may say something gay.
Oh, there
because he's fucking hot, and especially in this movie. I never actually really even really knew who he was until this movie, but I looked him up, and now I'm a fan. So
well, there you go.
Did you have, before we wrap up, did you have anything more you wanted to say on either of these movies?
No, I think I mostly got it out. The only other thing is I'm very, like I said, with the sort of 1-2 punch of X and Pearl, I'm not super optimistic for Maxine, the third entry into the trilogy, but I am very curious, and I will sure as hell be seeing it. So you got me, Ty West. I'm roped in, man. I'm hooked.
Before you see that, I would recommend you tracking down, if possible. I'm looking it up to see where if it's
House of the Devil.
House of the Devil. Yeah. Oh, it's on iTunes. Oh, it's on Peacock as well. So if you have Peacock and you want to watch, and you're thinking about watching Halloween Ends, and decide against it, watch this.
Well, I will probably see Halloween Ends in theaters.
Okay.
Against my better judgment, but it'll happen.
Fair enough.
I did actually just, not to prolong things, and we can cut this out, but I did go to see Terrifier 2 recently. Holy shit. I mean, have you seen all of the stuff that has been coming out sort of like around that movie where it's like, oh, people have been like fainting and throwing up?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say, I think that that's kind of silly, but it was a diabolically nasty and mean-spirited movie.
Okay.
Well, not in like a way that it's like, oh, boycott this, but like the kills are so gruesome. I was sitting there like covering my eyes. It's so bad.
Okay.
But
well, I feel like every 5 to 10 years or so, there's some horror movie that comes out and there's reports of people are fainting.
Oh yeah.
Like,
I mean, they did that with Paranormal Activity, didn't they? Or at least they did.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Which
I did read about it, but I also don't really take, like I said, I watch a lot of horror movies, so I don't take those headlines to mean very much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for hopping on and talking about elevated horror and occasionally X and It Follows.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see how many of our digressions get left in. That'll be a fun little Easter egg.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, can we find what?
Or it might just be there.
Maybe. It depends on how long I procrastinate. If I wait until the last minute, nothing's coming out.
Well, that's cool. So, if you're listening to this and you did just sit through us talking about The Mist and Smile and Barbarian and Candyman, then welcome to the end of the podcast.
Thanks for joining us all this way 2 hours later. Can we find you on social media?
Yeah, I am on Twitter and Letterboxd at Ratjacko, RATJACKO.
Excellent. I am So Brian Rowe. That's Brian with an I, ROWE, on Instagram, Twitter, and Letterboxd. And you can find the podcast at Piece of Pie Pod on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. Also Twitter, very occasionally. Thanks so much for listening. Go check out those movies. We seem to be moving into a once a month pattern, so we'll see you for Thanksgiving. And until then, go see some movies. Go see a scary movie.
Go see a scary movie.